You're watching live satellite news.
It's appropriate to say that this has been a very good week for Republicans, not only in Kentucky, but across the country. Starting here in Kentucky, the revolution that occurred on Tuesday, flipping the state house, was a dramatic change for our state after 95 years. As a citizen of our state, I'm really pleased that we now have the tools in place for the governor and his team to genuinely change Kentucky and make it more competitive with other states, which has been a very big problem for us for quite a long time. Obviously, my main focus was on the federal level. I had an opportunity yesterday in my office to sit down with President-elect Trump, Vice President-elect Pence. Melania Trump was there as well. We had a no-staff meeting for about an hour. Talked about the transition and issues that we have a joint interest in pursuing. And I'm very confident the administration is going to get off to a good start. I was particularly appreciative of the way the president handled the meeting at the White House. It underscores again that in this country, no matter how competitive the races are, how bitter the comments tend to be in our big raucous elections, when it's over, we respect the will of the American people and we move on from there. So with that, why don't I just throw it open and see what you'd like to talk about.
What do you make of these protests that you're seeing across the country?
You know, we have protesters in Lafayette Park across from the White House almost every day. So in our country, I can remember what was the Wall Street group that everybody was talking about a while back? Yeah, Occupy Wall Street. Going back to the beginning of this country, we've had a pretty open ability to complain about whatever you want to, and it's about as American as apple pie, and people are free to express themselves, and I don't think we ought to be unduly alarmed by it.
What's your comfort level with the president-elect since your meeting yesterday? Your comfort level with the president-elect since your meeting yesterday?
Yeah, quite good. Yeah, we had a good discussion about things that we're going to be pursuing in Congress. He met, as you know, with the Speaker as well, and things you'd expect us to talk about, like the Supreme Court, our concern about Obamacare and our desire to change that. Much of it reflected the positions that he took and many of us took prior to the election. The American people expect us to pursue the agenda that we talked about, and I'm confident that's what we're going to do. Larry?
What are your first priorities going to be after he's sworn in January? What's top of your list?
Well, first, if I can start with this year, we have 3 more weeks to finish up this year's work, and if I may, Lawrence, just start with that. Obviously, we have to decide how we're going to fund the government, because the Democratic minority in the Senate made it impossible for us to pass any of the individual appropriation bills that fund the government. So we now have to figure out how to do that. And also, there's another piece of legislation you haven't heard much about yet that's extremely important. It's called the 21st Century Cures Bill, which is a bipartisan proposal that I have a great interest in, and so does the president, the current president, and the current vice president. This is to jumpstart medical research with a significant increase in funding at NIH, with exciting new developments. For example, the president's particularly interested in precision medicine. The vice president, as a result of the loss of his son, is, as you may have read earlier this year, interested in the cancer moonshot. I'm interested in regenerative medicine. For example, in this country, unless you can get in a clinical trial, you can't take stem cells out of your own body to treat another part of your body. And I got interested in that because there was a man from Tennessee who came into the office who was legally blind 6 months ago and is now emailing and driving because he was able to get into a clinical trial to do something that's currently not allowed by FDA. To sum it up, we need to take advantage of today's technology to really jumpstart the medical field, in which there are enormous innovations occurring almost on a daily basis. So that's a this year matter. For next year, obviously, we'll be talking with the new president, and the speaker and I will be talking about the order in which to pursue our priorities. And honestly, I'm just not prepared to say what the order is going to be yet, but we'll obviously decide that before we reconvene in early January.
Senator, with the new Republican leadership in Washington, what do you think will be done to end the war on coal? And do you predict that we'll see job growth in the coal industry in Kentucky?
Well, I certainly would like to see the war on coal come to an end. As I've said repeatedly here over the last few years, the war on coal was not a result of anything Congress passed. There was no new legislation. This was all either executive orders or regulations that the president was involved in unilaterally on his own. So we are going to be presenting to the new president a variety of options that could end this assault. Whether that immediately brings business back is hard to tell because this is a private sector activity. One thing I do hope he'll do that I recommended yesterday that won't surprise any of you, and that is approve the Keystone Pipeline. That doesn't directly affect Kentucky, but talk about anxiety about jobs, particularly jobs for working class people. The president sat on the Keystone Pipeline throughout his entire 8 years, even though his own State Department said it had no measurable impact on climate in a bow to his extreme environmental supporters. But that requires no legislation. If there were an application for approval of the Keystone Pipeline, it could be approved like that. Estimates were that it could create up to 20,000 construction jobs almost immediately. That's the kind of thing that I hope he'll be looking at, and we're helping him look at, things that he can do quickly on his own, because much of what President Obama did that slowed our economy, he did on his own, either executive orders or regulations, executive branch only. And so one of the ways to get this economy growing again, I think, is to deal with regulatory changes.
And then just a quick follow-up. Eastern Kentucky has seen a lot of grants over the past couple of years in terms of trying to rebuild the industry and trying to diversify the economy. Do you predict that some of those grants will continue and we'll continue to see?
What kind of grants are you talking about?
If you look at like the Power Plus plan, or if you look at some SOAR initiatives.
You mean the Clean Power plans?
No, some of the money that's come from the president's plan to try and revitalize Appalachia.
Oh, I think that'll stay in place. Yeah. But let me tell you, a government spending program is not going to fix the problem. You have to have private sector growth. Let me just take you back to the almost $1 trillion stimulus, borrowed money, the beginning of the Obama administration. He was able to pass because he had total control of Congress. Can anybody think of anything as a result of it? $1 trillion? You know, a government spending program is not likely to solve the fundamental problem of growth. And there's some that make sense. For example, I support the Appalachian Regional Commission. I think it has done some good things over the years. And I support the effort to help these coal counties wherever we can. But that isn't going to replace, you know, what was there when we had a vibrant coal industry.
I'd like to get your thoughts on Mr. Trump's election. Were you surprised at what you saw?
Yeah, I was surprised. I, like everybody else, was watching all the polls. And, you know, not always, but usually the polls are right. They certainly weren't in Governor Bevin's race last year. They certainly weren't in my race in 14, although it predicted I would win. It was way off on the margin. And, but I think, like most Americans, I was surprised. Having said that, what he did and predicted he would do to a hail of skepticism was to pierce the blue wall. And if you follow presidential politics, as I know you all do, my party in a presidential race had not carried Pennsylvania since 1988, had not carried Wisconsin since 1984. I believe that was the last time we carried Michigan, was 1984. He carried all three of them. And I think clearly that was in those states that are typically referred to as Rust Belt states, where there have been a lot of job loss, an indication of the frustration people had with the status quo. And cut it any way you want to, this was an election between the status quo and change. If you sort of filter out the personalities and all the charges and countercharges, what you come up with in looking at this election was, are you satisfied with where we are, or do you want to go in a different direction? Fundamentally, I think these people were not satisfied with the status quo, and that was what allowed him to win the election.
Do you think any new trade deals are dead now with Donald Trump?
Well, let me just tell you, Trade Promotion Authority, which is the mechanism that allows a president to negotiate a trade agreement and submit it for an up or down vote in Congress without amendment, is still there. And so President-elect Trump will have the option, if he chooses to use it, to negotiate I think he would say, a better agreement, and submit it to Congress. It'll be up to him to initiate the process. These trade agreements are negotiated by administrations before they come to us.
Did you talk to him about entitlements yesterday?
No, we didn't discuss
Would you
that.
like to see Congress take up entitlement?
We're going to pursue the agenda that he talked about during the election. I think the American people expect us to do that, and we'll be discussing with him, what makes sense to do first. And since we have a majority in all three bodies, we'll try to coordinate which issue comes first and second and third. Joe?
During the campaign, President-elect Trump suggested 35% tariffs on companies that move jobs out of the country. Is that going to find a home in the Senate?
Look, the whole issue of taxation, he also talked about, which is the need for tax reform. And the Speaker and I had hoped to be able to do something like that with the current president. That proved to be impossible. I think he's very interested in tax reform. If you're talking about the way we levy things, whether it's tariffs or income taxes or whatever. My assumption is we'll deal with taxes in a comprehensive way in some kind of major tax reform bill sometime in the coming year.
Have you given the president-elect any advice on building his cabinet?
No, obviously, I'm not going to share with you all any kind of detailed advice, but no, we didn't really talk about that. Yeah.
Yesterday, I interviewed Congressman John Yarmuth, and he mentioned that the comments that Hillary Clinton made about coal and the now infamous quote about coal miners being put out of work, that was deadly for Kentucky Democrats, and that cost Democrats any chance at holding the Kentucky House of Representatives. What role do you think that comment played in Kentucky elections and then overall in other states that rely on coal?
It was certainly helpful. It was certainly helpful. In our state, in Southeast Ohio, and in West Virginia. Not that any of those states were particularly in doubt in the presidential election. Ohio was fairly competitive. But down ballot, if you look what happened to the Speaker of the House in Kentucky and others, Democratic representatives in areas that used to vote overwhelmingly Democrat, I don't think there's any question it was helpful.
Did she cost them their elections?
Who knows, but it was helpful. It was certainly helpful.
You think Tuesday changed the electoral map in these state house races?
I'm sorry?
You think that Tuesday's elections changed the maps of the electoral map in these House of Representatives races?
It was certainly helpful to have the top of the ticket doing as well as it did. Having these state legislative races in federal election years was clearly an advantage to us this year, if you look at the margin of the president-elect in our state.
Senator, one more question. Do you plan to promote Judge DeBar for the Supreme Court?
I'm not here today to make any pronouncements about the Supreme Court, except to say that President Trump will make a selection and the Senate will act on it expeditiously.
I do want to ask about the fact that you held the Senate, the margin narrow, but your thoughts on how the Senate did.
Well, it was a pretty exciting night because, you know, the odds were really tough for us. We had 24 members up this cycle. They only had 10. Of their 10, only one was competitive, and they kept it. That was Nevada. And so I had members in states that were very, very competitive in the presidential election as well. New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina was very competitive. Missouri and Indiana were not competitive at the top, but we still had competitive Senate races with Senator Blunt and Senator-to-be Todd Young. So it was a very, I described it maybe to some of you earlier as sort of like a knife fight in a phone booth in every one of those places. And many of those races were really close. We lost Senator Ayotte in New Hampshire by a mere 1,000 votes. That's always tough. She was really something, but other than her loss, the only other loss we had was anticipated. Senator Kirk in Illinois. Illinois is a really tough state for us. So it was a great day, and we're looking forward to having a cycle ahead of us in which there are 25 of them up and only 8 of us.
You always talk about how you need 60 votes to get things done in the Senate. I mean, are you going to be able to work with minority Democrats? Or do you think there'll be a roadblock trying to get things done?
No, it will require some. That's the way the Senate operates. It's the only legislative body in the world where a majority is not enough. So we don't have a hammerlock on the Senate, but the majority does give you the ability to set the agenda, which makes a big difference. At least you know what you. I get to determine what we're going to talk about. But after that, yeah, you need Democratic cooperation to do most things in the Senate. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but most things require some level of cooperation. And I anticipate it. I mean, this is not just post-election sweet talk here. There are at least 5 Democrats running for re-election in 2018 in very red states. I think they're going to want to be cooperative with us on a variety of different things, and I look forward to that cooperation. Senator Schumer and I have already begun to talk. He's a smart, transactional person, and I think we'll get along just fine.
One more, if you don't mind. Having met with the president-elect now briefly, do you think he has what it takes, temperament and otherwise, to have a successful presidency?
I do.
Was higher education a topic of conversation?
No, we didn't get into that.
We go back to the Supreme Court. Your strategy about holding up the Supreme Court hearings, there was a lot of criticism on you. Even some in your own party thought maybe it was time to bend, but you stood your ground and you stayed. And in the last few days, we've heard some pundits calling it a brilliant strategy. I see the smile starting to come across your face. Long term, was it a brilliant strategy, and have people called you eating crow the last few days on the
Well,
GOP?
what it wasn't was all that unusual. Let me take you back to what I said last February. It had been 80 years since a vacancy on the Supreme Court occurring in the middle of a presidential election was confirmed. You'd have to go back to 1888. Grover Cleveland in the White House, a Republican Senate, to find the last time a vacancy created in the middle of a presidential election year was confirmed. My friend Joe Biden, when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 1992, a presidential election year, even though there was not a vacancy, he opined on the floor of the Senate that if a vacancy occurred, they wouldn't fill it. So I don't think what I did was outside the norm. It's almost certainly what would have happened no matter what if you had divided government. You know, one party in the White House, another party. And I think it made sense to the American people. They tried to make it a political issue in a number of these states. It flopped because people didn't think it was unreasonable when you're in the middle of a presidential election year to say, well, maybe the American people ought to pick the next president to make this appointment, since it's going to affect the country potentially for 25 or 30 years. So I think I took some heat in the beginning, but I think I had a credible argument for it, and it didn't adversely impact in any of our races, and in fact, it may have been helpful in a number of them. Thanks a lot.
You're watching Live Satellite News.